What if I told you that there's a place on Long Island that the government swears is shut down, but the power still runs there at night? A place where that old radar dish, the one that they supposedly decommissioned back in 1969, still shifts a few degrees when no one's around. And what if I told you that the men who claimed that they worked there said they didn't just test radar? They said that they opened something, not a doorway, but a tear in reality itself. And the locals claim that if you stand out there on a foggy night, sometimes you'll feel a weird vibration under your feet that they call the hum. They say that it comes from those cliffs beneath Camp Hero and that old radar base that the government insists is dead. But the funny thing is, the fences that surround it always seem to be patched, and those warning signs keeping everybody out, they always seem to look new. And they say that ever so often, they see a weird military-type truck going in at night and leaving just before sunrise. There's people who lived in Montauk their whole life that swear that that base, it never truly shut down. And the ones who worked around black budget programs, they'll tell you that Montauk lines up with things that we can prove really existed, like MK Ultra, Project Artichoke, and Project Stargate. This was brain tech research that was decades before its time. You had mind control, electromagnetic influence, psychic warfare, and some say time distortion. These threads we can all prove are real and knotted together into one place that people weren't supposed to look at twice. Tonight, we're going to open the file on something that they tried to erase. This is the Montauk Project. Welcome back, listeners and watchers, to another dark and disturbing episode of Relative Perspective. As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and tonight we're diving into our third episode of Forbidden Knowledge November. Now, our first episode, we did a deep dive into Admiral Byrd and that weird flight that he did down there in Antarctica. And guys, I really appreciate what you did. Y'all lit that episode up, and that means the world to me. Thank you so much. And our episode last week, we spoke about the secrets below the Vatican. But tonight, we're headed to the other side of the map at Montauk Point in Long Island, and to that weird base that the government swears is just a Cold War relic, but whose history it starts way earlier than that. Most folks, they know Montauk for their beaches and their fishing, but for people that have been paying attention, they feel deep down that it's something way worse. They claim that this is a base that shouldn't exist, and they did experiments that shouldn't have happened. Get away, fly. Shit, sorry about that. And down there deep in the dark, there was a machine that should have never, ever been turned on. So go ahead and grab your flashlight, grab whatever sanity you have left, because tonight we're going deep underground, straight into the Montauk Project, and to what some say they tried to erase. Okay, if you go to Montauk today, it doesn't look like the setting of a sci-fi film or a horror film. It looks normal. You have families walking their dog and people taking selfies in front of this ugly-looking radar tower and a huge sign welcoming you into Camp Hero. But that sign is actually the last layer that they put on, because this place was not always a park. Let's go ahead and roll the clock all the way back to 1942, when the world was on fire. There were German U-boats in the Atlantic picking off merchant ships up and down the East Coast. And the one place that America couldn't afford to lose was New York Harbor. So the military looks at a map, picks Montauk Point as the perfect place to watch the seas. So they started building what they called back then Fort Hero. They dug into the cliffs and built a fortress that was hid from view. They had huge 16-inch guns, searchlights that could cut through the fog at night, and barracks for all the crewmen that worked right there at Montauk Point. And underneath everything, they had ammo bunkers and service tunnels that they cut straight in to that bedrock. On surface, it was just dunes, scrub brush, and ocean. But underneath, it was a hollowed-out machine. Then World War II was over, and of course, the enemy changed. And that base, it changed with it. The war, it finally ended, but the fear, it never did. The swastika, it's torn down, but the hammer and sickle, it goes up. Now it's not U-boats that they're worried about. It's long-range Soviet bombers coming over the ice and going straight down the coast. And during that time in the 50s, the Air Force, it steps in and it gives the place a makeover. And now Fort Hero, it becomes Camp Hero. And those huge 16-inch guns, they basically become background scenery. And the new star of the show is that huge radar dish that they put up. And as you can see, this thing was massive. It stood about 80 feet tall. With that dish, it almost was big enough to be its own building. Now, what's crazy about this dish, it could actually see planes from 200 miles away. And of course, it wasn't just watching for fun, it was wired to something much bigger. And that something bigger was called SAGE. Now, SAGE, it stood for Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. You can basically look at it like this. It was like the nervous system of America's early radar detection system. And believe it or not, this wasn't the only radar. They had radars all over the country that were sending signals back to this giant computer. Camp Hero, it was just one of the eyes. If a bomber formation popped up over the Atlantic, the radar here would see it and they would beam the signal back to SAGE. And someone sitting in a dark room far, far away from Montauk would scramble a bunch of jets to go meet them. Then the rules changed again. And that important base, it got left behind. Now, by the late 1960s, missiles replaced bombers in everybody's nightmares. They called them ICBMs, or Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. And what's scary is these things could cross oceans in minutes. And you don't need a radar looking for slow planes if the real threat is warheads dropping straight out of space. So, in 1969, Camp Hero is shut down. And the official story was basically mission over, the equipment was deactivated, and they began looking for threats somewhere else. Now, what's weird is they claimed that there was a small Air Force presence there that stuck around for a while. But then in 1981, the base officially shut down. Except anybody that lived out there will tell you that's not what it felt like. They claimed that after the closure, it didn't look like an abandoned ruin. They said that the fences stayed up, no trespassing signs all over the place, and a lot of people claimed that they saw huge security trucks going in late at night. Now, there was no tours at that time, there was no rangers, but there was someone clearly still taking care of that place. And then there's a question of the power. Folks who work utilities out there have all said the same thing. Camp Hero was pulling electricity long after it was supposed to be dead. There was no offices and no official staff that was listed working there. But they claimed there was steady juice still going into those buildings anyways. And if you take a look and zoom in on the map, it definitely gets a lot stranger. About 50 miles west of Camp Hero, you've got Brookhaven National Laboratories. Now, that's not conspiracy lore, that is actually a real government building. And what's weird is this building actually ties to something that we discussed way back about CERN. This place actually had one of the first particle accelerators. So you've got a remote base with underground tunnels and huge bunkers that's carved into the bedrock, and a major nuclear and particle physics lab that's just right up the road. Okay, I have to admit, maybe these two dots are just dots. Or maybe if you're looking for a quiet place to push the envelope, you run the safe stuff over at Brookhaven. And you can ship the dangerous ones to a closed-down military base that nobody is supposed to know is even there. Now, that's the moment right there that Camp Hero stops being Cold War trivia and starts sounding a lot like a prequel to something else much darker. Because believe me, the rumors that come next, they don't talk about big guns or radar screens. They talk about huge rooms that never made it into Montauk blueprints, sublevels that didn't officially exist, and equipment in those tunnels that had nothing to do with watching the sky, and everything to do with getting inside the human mind. And that's where the next piece of this file comes in. This is the one that keeps people up at night. The machine that they say lived at the heart of this base. It's called the Montauk chair. Okay, before we do a deep dive into that chair, you really need to know where these stories came from. Everything that you're about to hear, the experiments, the kids, the tunnels, and that creature, none of that was public until one man cracked. In the early 1990s, an electrical engineer by the name of Preston Nichols published and co-authored a book called The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time. Now, the crazy part is he claimed that he didn't remember working at Camp Hero. He said the memories came back later and they came back slow, almost like someone had tried to bury him and missed a couple of pieces. Now, according to Nichols, he spent years under that base. He claimed that he worked from the early 70s to the early 80s working on a project that didn't officially exist. He talked about mind control, psychic warfare, time experiments, and a machine that was so dangerous they actually had to shut down power to the whole base. Okay, let me step back. I want you to listen for a second. Nichols, he's been basically called every name in the book. They called him crazy, a con man, a storyteller, a whistleblower, and there are actually a few other names that I really don't care to mention on here. But here's what makes his claims kind of hard to dismiss. Every person that came forward after him told basically the same story, and they all described that same machine in that same room, and it was doing the same impossible thing. And that machine we're talking about is where this file gets dark. Have you ever seen something with a name so harmless that it almost seems like a joke? Like someone tried to make it sound friendly just so they can hide what they were actually doing. That's basically what the Montauk chair is. It's not a recliner and it's not a stool. Hell, it's not something that you'd ever want to sit in. They describe it, the men who claim that they were there, as this heavy metal seat bolted deep into the ground as if they were scared that it would get up and walk away. There were thick cables running across the floor and up the walls, racks of monitors and equipment humming like beehives, and just above that chair was a huge ring of wires shaped like a crown. Not a nice one. I want you to think torture device in the future. And that whole setup, according to them, just had one purpose: to take a thought and push it out into the real world. Okay, the early tests, it really wasn't that dramatic. They weren't opening portals or summoning monsters just yet. They started with baby steps. They'd either put a glass on a table in the next room or a lit candle. Then they'd strap a guy in a chair, put sensors all over his head, and they'd tell him, okay, make it move. And here's where these weird stories line up. Sometimes they said the water would ripple, and they said sometimes the candle that they put in that room would flicker, even though there was no moving air. And you have scientists and skeptics that always start with the same line: it was just a coincidence. And of course, they're all good at this. They spent millions trying to prove that it wasn't a coincidence. Okay, the details that keep theorists up at night, it's not the chair. It's what the chair was actually plugged into. People who claim to have worked on this dark project said that this chair, it wasn't just wired to computers. They said that the wires, they ran out of the room, out of the building, and straight into that huge radar tower. Now, this thing, it wasn't meant to read your thoughts. It was meant to broadcast them. Fear, images, memories, even nightmares. Whatever you focused on in that chair, they say it didn't stay in your head. And according to the men that talk about it right now, fear was the emotion that lit this thing up like a Christmas tree. Okay, this is the part that nobody really likes to talk about, but if we're going to dig into this, we can't really skip it. We're talking about the ones who call themselves the Montauk Boys. The ones who say that they lived through this insist that the chair, it didn't work very well with adults. You see, adults question things, adults resist, and adults, they really don't imagine like a child does. And the darkest and scariest allegation is also the simplest. Kids, they break easier, they believe quicker, and kids can think of things that adults, they can't put into words anymore. Okay, I want you to understand something. This is not proven fact. But all the people who share these stories, they're decades apart and states apart. They all describe the same environment. They described bright rooms with no windows, no clocks on the wall, buzzing tones, and endless commands on repeat. Now, the more you dig into this, the more it sounds less like a lab and more like somebody was trying to reboot the human mind. Okay, the survivors that came forward, they paint a brutal, brutal picture. They talk about lights that were so bright that it felt like it melted their thoughts. Loud, loud tones that drilled into your brain. Days and days with no sleep, then sudden forced sleep. And constant voices on loops saying the same phrase over and over. Fear, it was used like a lever. They say that one phrase got pushed into him so much that they could hear it even without anybody speaking it. They said it was a focus on the picture and make it real. And if you do it right, you do a good job, you get warmth, food, and a break. And if you didn't, the lights came back on, the sounds were blasted, and they wouldn't let you sleep for days. These guys say that it wasn't just about controlling the kids. They were trying to turn their minds into a transmitter. Okay, the first things that they talk about that these kids actually pushed out were, weird and tiny. It was stuff like, little balls of light or shadows on the wall, little things. They were shapes that appeared for a second and then they vanished, they disappeared. But like always, the stories start to change. They claim that these boys, they started creating things that look like humans, animals, and they also created things that didn't look like humans at all. There was one survivor who actually claimed that the thing that he created out of thin air was a monster that he used to see in his nightmares. He said the thing had long arms, dark, a blank face, and it was just standing there staring at him in a corner. And there was another kid that claimed that there was a tall shadow figure that he created that would stay longer and longer the longer that he used that chair. It's almost like that machine, that chair, was teaching these things how to stick around. And these kids, they weren't the only ones seeing this, and the people that were pushing the envelope with these kids, the guards actually claimed to see stuff. According to their stories, they heard footsteps in the hall. They'd see these huge doors that they had under there slam shut. And they actually heard their names whispered over their radios, and they said nobody was trying to call them. And like I said before, whatever that chair was pulling from those kids, it didn't fade away when those tests ended. The claim is that they started sticking around. Okay, at some point, the scientists thought that it would be a good idea to weaponize and use the thing that these kids were creating. And they even gave it a name. They called it the Sentinel. The idea was insane, but it was simple. Have dozens of kids picture the same creature for hours. And they said not to stop until the chair forced this thing into shape. They said this thing was huge. It was a tall shadow with glowing eyes, long arms, and huge claws. And according to testimonies, they say it didn't vanish when the test stopped. There was one technician who claimed that he saw it moving on its own, and while he was walking through the corridor, this thing, he said the lights started popping out one by one. And there was another guy that said that there was this huge steel door that bent inwards like someone was on the other side pushing it. And of course, there's a bunch of notes and paperwork that people claimed to have seen that were all blacked out. But there was one line they said they saw that wasn't. It said, "Do not let them think of fear." I think they learned their lesson, hopefully. No one has a full picture of what happened to these boys that were involved in this program, not even them. Now, I've heard stories from some of them, and believe me, they're horrific. Most of them say that their memory was erased or they blocked it out because it was so bad. Some claim that they don't remember anything at all. So, if even a fraction of what they're saying is true about this stuff, if that chair could actually pull something out of a human mind and give it shape, then whatever they conjured down there, it didn't just disappear when they shut off the power. Some people believe that it's down there still waiting for someone to sit back down in that chair. They say the deeper that you went down into Camp Hero, the more the world above, it faded away. There was no wind, no ocean, just damp concrete and that weird vibration under your feet. And the people who claimed that they worked down there said those long tunnels it didn't feel quite like a military base. They'd say weird things like the temperature changed about every 100 feet. Some parts would feel hot like a boiler room, when some parts was as cold as a refrigerator. And they said that every door was color coded. There was green for labs, yellow for control rooms, and then there was the red labels, and these were the places that you couldn't go unless someone with a badge took you. And beneath all of it, past the floors that never appeared on any blueprint, was that dark chamber, the room that was built for the Montauk chair. And now we're about to talk about the night that everything went wrong. Okay, before we go into one of the most important nights of this story, you need to understand something about the timing. Because the science at Montauk, they weren't working in some kind of vacuum. According to some of their testimonies, they were actually tapping into something that they thought had happened before. I'm talking about the Philadelphia experiment. And to them, this wasn't just a ghost story, this really happened. The date was October 28th of 1943. Now, they claim that what's important about this date is it lined up with some kind of weird electromagnetic field that happens every 20 years. It basically runs on a 20-year cycle. And here's where Montauk comes in. Now, according to Preston Nichols and others who talked later, August 12th was the center of that 20-year cycle. He claimed that it was actually the strongest point of that 20-year cycle. So, if the Navy blasted a ship with electromagnetic fields in 1943, and Montauk fired up a machine built to manipulate space, thought, and time in 83, they basically theorized that those two events could lock onto each other, almost like tuning forks vibrating across decades. And on August 12th of 1983, right on schedule, they flipped that switch. Okay, a little bit after midnight on August 12th, they fired that thing up. And when they did, witnesses claimed that the walls shook so hard that it actually knocked dust from the ceiling. And they said that the floor vibrated so hard that it felt like there was a subwoofer under their feet, under that concrete. And they claimed that outside that giant radar dish right behind me, the one that was supposed to be decommissioned, they said it started moving by itself. They said it was slow, deliberate, and it locked onto a position that it hadn't locked onto in years. Now, inside, they claimed that that hum that we were talking about became a roar. They said the air got so cold that you could actually see your breath. And then came the pressure shift. You know that feeling you get when you're flying in a plane and your ears pop? But they said it just kept going back and forth. It never steadied. It never stabilized. It just kept going back and forth. It was almost like the base, it couldn't decide which reality it needed to lean into. And then it all snapped. Every light blew out, the backup generator kicked on, and then the room filled with that red flickering light. And here's where it gets crazy. Right in the center of that room, right in front of that chair, something opened. They claimed that it looked like a void. It wasn't a doorway. It wasn't a shimmer. They said that it looked like a spinning black hole that sucked the air in around it. Some claimed that it looked like deep water. Others swear that they saw a corridor with walls that didn't match anything in that base. And there was a few that spoke years later. They said they saw something that looked like the hull of a ship, a shape that they recognized from years before of the USS Eldridge. Now, that was the ship that they tried to basically make disappear during the Philadelphia experiment. Now, I know we spoke a little bit about the Philadelphia experiment. I'd really, really like to do a show about that. If you'd like to see me do a show about that, go ahead and put it in the comments below. I'd like to hear what you think. Now, what's crazy is they didn't just see things on the other side. They claimed that there was something that stepped through that hole into our world. Witnesses said that it appeared like a glitch. They said that it was tall, thin, arms too long, and they said that its head was tilting almost like it was confused. And those red emergency lights that I mentioned before, they said it was flickering off its skin almost like it wasn't solid. They said it was almost like it was shifting from being here to being somewhere else. And the second it stepped through the threshold, through that hole, they said everything technological, it died. They said radios, monitors, all the computers, even the backup generators just shut down. And they said that there was a weird noise, kind of like static coming through the hole and some people claimed that they'd heard voices, thousands of them screaming like they were in pain. They claimed that the creature, it moved like smoke one second and then something heavy the next. They said it was strong enough to bend metal. It left huge, deep claw marks in the concrete walls. And they said when it passed someone, they said their skin prickled almost like they were standing too close to a transmitter. They did everything that they could think of to shut the system down, but that chair, it wouldn't allow them to shut it down. They said every breaker that they pulled, it sent power to somewhere else, and the machine was basically powering itself. They claimed that there was one technician that hauled ass to the main breaker system, and he pulled the main breaker down with everything that he had. The sound of that roar, it cut instantly. All those red lights died, and that thing that was roaming the halls let out one last roar that was so loud it echoed through the whole tunnel system. Then the monster was gone, and that huge hole collapsed in on itself. It was gone, almost like it had never been there. But what was still there was that bent metal, those claw marks, and the fear that it caused the people that saw it. Okay, the real question about this night isn't whether they shut down that machine. It's whether shutting it down was enough. After that night in 1983, Camp Hero, it didn't just shut down, it was dissolved. Reports stopped, personnel vanished, and within weeks, the camp was fenced off. And the official explanation was they said it was environmentally hazardous. They said they had leaking tanks and contaminated soil that they had to remove. But some of the locals said that it didn't look like a cleanup. It almost looked like they were trying to erase a crime scene. They said that they saw huge trucks roll in after midnight. Then they saw welders go in there with fixed plates and weld all the entrances shut, almost like they were keeping something in, not trying to keep something out. Yeah, anything that could be burned was burned, and anything that couldn't was boxed off and carried away. It was almost like the same playbook that they used for MK Ultra. Destroy the files, destroy the gear, destroy the trail. And by sunrise, Camp Hero was already disappearing from the record. Now, when the land around Camp Hero turned into a state park, most people thought that that was the end of it. They put in hiking trails, picnic tables, and that giant radar dish behind me was repurposed as a historical marker. But here's the part that nobody has an answer for. Some say that the park, it still draws power, and a lot of it. No offices and no active facilities. Yet the power bill, it stays steady and it's always paid on time. And there's some locals that swear that there's still maintenance trucks going into this place at 3 a.m. and leaving at sunrise. And they also sometimes say that they see that radar dish moving at night. Slow, deliberate, almost like something is still living below the surface. And in my opinion, you don't feed power to a corpse unless something down there is still breathing. Now, like I said before, there was a few men that came forward, a guy by the name of Preston Nichols, Al Bielek, and there was a few others that claimed that they worked on the program. And that's pretty much where we get all this information from. Now, the newspapers, of course, they called them crazy. But all these men, they described the same details. They described the same shape of the tunnels, the constant hum in the concrete, the freezing air pockets, and that crazy-ass night when the machine, it wouldn't shut off. Nichols even rebuilt part of the chair years later and claimed that he could still pick up the same frequency. It's almost like that signal, it never fully died. Okay, you have some theorists that believe that the Montauk Project, it didn't end when that base was shut down. They think it just changed form. Back then, it was radar waves and electromagnetic tests. But today, it's algorithms, emotional mapping, dream studies, and behavioral prediction. This new tech, it's not hidden deep in a bunker somewhere. It's actually sitting in our pockets right now. It's the same goal as MK Ultra and Project Artichoke. Influence the mind without ever touching you. Maybe Camp Hero, it was never the final stage. It was the prototype for something else. Now, here's another weird story that people claim is tied to that project. In '08, there was some weird-looking creature that washed up on Montauk Beach, and they called it the Montauk Monster. It was hairless, bloated, and distorted, and nobody could identify it quickly enough before it disappeared. Now, you had some experts that claim it was just a bloated raccoon, but there were some people that weren't quite convinced. But here's what matters for our story tonight: that one strange carcass, combined with a few other odd finds that were found along New York coastlines throughout the years, they all kept this rumor alive. Now, this is not proof, it's not confirmation, it's just enough strangeness to keep people asking, what else has washed up that we haven't been able to see? Next, we're going to be digging into part of the story that most people miss: the pattern that's hidden across decades, and why Montauk's fingerprints keep showing up in places that they shouldn't. Okay, the government line, it's simple. They said that Camp Hero is just a radar station for air defense. And after the Cold War, they closed it. They said there's no psychic projects, no secret labs, and no missing kids. They point to missing records and basically say, see, that's proof that none of this existed. But to me, that's how a good cover up works. You erase so much of it that it basically sounds normal. But what's weird is the same blueprint, it shows up in a lot of other places. Like a psychic training program in Fort Meade in the 70s, that's what they call Project Stargate. And you had MK Ultra and Artichoke. And now we're having behavioral control studies coming out of Silicon Valley that all feel a little too familiar. They all had different names, but they had the same goal: influence the human mind without ever touching it. That's the pattern I was talking about earlier that never goes away. It just gets a new coat of paint. And also, have you ever noticed that some of our movies and TV shows basically tell the same story? You got a small town, a hidden lab, someone with powers, sometimes a kid, and a portal that should never open. And one of those shows, which is pretty popular, it's actually coming out in the next couple of days, it's called Stranger Things. This show was literally called Montauk in its first draft. That's where they got the story. And there's other movies like The Philadelphia Experiment or The Men That Stare at Goats, and even old X-File episodes. And every time someone tells you to relax, it's just fiction, I don't know if they know it or not, but they're also keeping this story alive. It's just dressed up as entertainment. Now, I hit on this a little bit before, but I want you guys to think about how connected we are right now. You've got phone, Wi-Fi, smart speakers, pretty much all of it. And every one of them are sending signals that we can't see. If there was a machine that they claimed back in the 1980s that could broadcast human emotion, what could a network of billions do today? Here's what's crazy. Maybe the experiment, it didn't end. It just got a new interface. The hum, it's no longer in those cliffs on Montauk. It's in our pockets. Now, here's the part that most people don't think about. If they came this close to controlling thoughts back then, do you think that they would just throw that away? No, they'd bury it, rename it, and bring it back when technology caught up. The Montauk Project might be dead and buried, but believe me, the idea isn't. And maybe the real experiment was not what that machine could do, but it's how long they can keep us looking the other way. Next, we close the file on the Montauk Project. But if you've learned anything about tonight, it's that some files, they never stay closed. Okay, guys, thanks for riding along on this deep, dark dive into one of the most strangest legends that we've tried to bury here in America. You've been listening to Relative Perspective, and as always, I'm your host, Stephen. If you've made it here this far, I want you to do me a favor. Go ahead and slam down on that like button and hit the subscribe button. And I want to hear from you. Go ahead and put down in the comments what you think really happened over there in Camp Hero. Was it science gone too far, or was it something else entirely? Okay, if you've got a story, a strange encounter, a haunting, or something that you just can't explain, I want to hear your story. All you have to do is email me at relativeperspective76@gmail.com. I promise I do my best to read all the emails that you guys send me, and thank you so much for that. Because to me, this show is built on real stories and real people. And together, I feel like we're piecing together a truth that they're trying to hide from us. Okay, before we go, I want to say one more thing. Maybe the Montauk Project was about more than just a machine. Maybe it was a mirror. It's showing us how far some people are willing to go just to feel in control. And that is a scary, scary thought. But here's a good thing. The truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. It always has, and it always will. Thanks again for watching. God bless you. We love you. And good night. Whew, this is a long one. You ain't getting my ass in that chair. Thanks for watching. Bye.